Descartes became interested in medicine at the end of 1629. He was 33 and had settled in the Low Countries in the spring of the same year. He had not studied medicine, and he did not try to hold a degree from a medical university in those days when medical teaching for men only was poor in its quality and unequal in its content from one university to the other. The use of human dissections was scarce. There was an exception in Europe, Padua, the University of the Republic of Venice, where the famous Fabricius of Aquapendente had taught for more than 40 years, with Gaspard Boin and William Harvey among his students. Part 1. Descartes' Medical Library and the Writing of L'Homme. Ce n'est pas un crime d'être curieux de l'anatomie. Descartes began to study medicine in the context of the writing of an ambitious treatise in French, not in Latin, dealing with the new conceptions of cosmology as well as the foundations of the laws of nature. In this treatise combining science and metaphysics, Le Monde, Descartes decided to include a chapter dealing with l'homme. For Descartes, writing about human beings in its scientific state means dealing with medicine, and first of all with anatomy. He began to study anatomy in December 1629, reading Vesalius and the others, and observing while dissecting various animals. Descartes acknowledged a debt towards Andreas Vesalius as a starting point for his knowledge of anatomy. The reference to such a name and the importance devoted to observation through dissections have to be considered seriously. In anatomy, as well as in cosmology, in L'Homme, as well as in Le Monde, Descartes wanted to draw information from the most recent sources, from Copernicus to Galileo in physics, from Vesalius to the others in anatomy. Descartes wrote his treatise in the wake of the most recent ideas, those resulting from the famous year 1543, when the old Copernicus published in Nuremberg his De Revolutionibus, and when the young Vesalius had his De Humani Corporis Fabrica published in Basel. Vesalius was teaching anatomy in Padua, and he was already famous for his skill in human dissections and his interest in accurate anatomical images. Vesalius' aim in his treatise was to show the fabric of the human body and to restore the lost knowledge of the human body. The term fabrica refers to a conception of the body as an admirable work made by nature associated with providence. In Vesalius' book, the superb images with articulated skeletons, écorchés, flayed mane, revealing their muscles, stage this masterpiece of nature, which is the human body. A body studied through human dissections, as shown in the title page of the Fabrica, repeated in the Epitome and in the second edition of the Fabrica. And the dissection has to be performed by the anatomist himself, as Vesalius proved by his example. This way of proceeding was a break with the traditional teaching based on Galen read during the lesson by the teacher of anatomy, while the prosector was opening and showing the parts of the body. With Vesalius, the anatomy lesson aims to denounce the error of Galen, who mostly dissected animals. From that moment on, emphasis was given to the sight and to the touch in anatomy. But if the human body has to be admired, it is also because it holds its dignity from the soul that gives life. But where is the soul in the body? This question is based on the debate between Aristotle and Galen about the seat of the soul, either in the heart or in the brain. When Descartes mentioned the name of Vesalius in his correspondence, he also refers to the others, which means that Vesalius opened the way and that other anatomists had followed his example. Such was the case in the Low Countries, where there were published where there were books published in the Vesalian manner. But this aspect of the medical life is also shown in Rembrandt's famous painting, The Anatomy of Dr. Tulp, painted in 1632 in Amsterdam when Descartes was writing law. This historical painting evokes the only one public anatomy in Amsterdam during the winter 1632, an anatomy performed by Dr. Tulp on a criminal condemned to death. This painting of the members of the Anatomical Guild belongs to the history of medicine and ideas in an amazing manner, because what is shown is just an imaginary anatomical lesson, simply because in those days no anatomy would ever begin with the arm. It would end with it. So Dr. Tulp must have asked Rembrandt to portray him in such a way. And if Tulp asked Rembrandt to portray him like that, it was just while dissecting the muscles of the forearm that allow the fingers to move. It was because Tulp wanted to be seen, wanted to be painted in a Vesalian character, because we have to remember the portrait of Vesalius at the beginning of the Fabrica. Hence, we can see that Tulp is a Vesalius redivivus. At the same moment in Europe, books were printed in the Vesalian style. This is the case for the Theatrum Anatomicum by Gaspard Boin. This book was famous all over Europe. Boin was professor of medicine in Basel. Boin was the most important among the other anatomists read by Descartes. Boin's smaller book than Vesalius' Fabrica brought together, completed, and updated the anatomical drawings found in Vesalius' books. These anatomical images did help Descartes from the moment when he began to practice his anatomical experiments. In 1629, Descartes lived in Kalverstraat, Street of the Carls, meaning Street of the Butchers, who supplied him with fresh organs to dissect. Descartes' knowledge of anatomy comes from Vesalius and from Boin, and Descartes' knowledge of embryology comes from Fabricius of Aquapendente and from Descartes' own anatomical experiments. With a reference to Fabricius, Descartes once more acknowledged his debt to Renaissance medicine. Descartes' Latin fragments, the Primae Cogitationes circa generationem animanium and the Excerpta Anatomica, very difficult text, I agree with Fabrizio, these texts prove that Descartes had read the two embryological treatises by Fabricius, the De Ovipoli, the formation of the egg and chick, as shown in this picture, and the De Formatu Fetu. These books have magnificent engraved plates showing the formation of the chick, showing aborted human fetuses with their membranes and or wrappings and their umbilical cord, and pregnant female animal bodies and various mammalian embryos with and without their membranes and their umbilical cord. In his embryological dissections, Descartes was interested in the order in which the organ arise during gestation. In his anatomical treatises, with beautiful images, Fabricius showed that nature does nothing in vain. He also mentioned that the degrees of the soul, vegetative and nutritive, have to be taken into account in the study of generation. It has to be noted that all the physicians and surgeons in Europe agreed that the human body draws its life, that is to say, its animation, its motion, from the soul or vital principle or principle of life. The human body is the dwelling of the soul. Death meant the departure of that soul. Riolan the Younger clearly stated, man is composed of two really different natures, the soul and the body. The former, which is linked with the body, is a principle of life and of all the actions, and therefore the form and perfection of the body. In June 1632, Descartes wrote to Mersenne that in Le Monde he had decided not to include how animals are generated, because it would have taken him too long. And this is confirmed in the Discourse on Method. In this letter, Descartes wrote that he had finished all that he had planned in his treatise about inanimate bodies, and he added that he only has to add something concerning the nature on man. He will then write a fair copy and send it to Mersenne, that we dare not say when that will be, because he has already failed his promise. The question of the nature of man is indeed a crucial one in the history of medicine, since the eponymous treatise in the Hippocratic Corpus, commented by Galen. This treatise became associated with the Christian anthropology and the importance of the passions of the soul, which leads to the obscure question of the union of the soul to the body, to the study of the senses, especially sight, and to the three parts of the soul in medical treatises, naturalis or vegetativa, sentient or sensitiva, and intelligence or rationalis. In November or December 1632, Descartes explained to Mersenne, "My discussion of man in Le Monde will be a little fuller than I had intended, for I have undertaken to explain all the main functions in man. I have already written of the vital functions, such as the digestion of food, the heartbeat, the distribution of nourishments, etc., and the five senses. I am now dissecting the heads of various animals, so that I can explain what imagination, memory consist in. In l'homme, Descartes located the seat of imagination and common sense in a gland in the brain. He didn't mention the name of the gland, but referred to it by using the letter H, already used by Boin in his Theatrum Anatomicum. And Boin took a plate from Vesalius, but Vesalius used other letters. In the same letter, Descartes also questioned Mersenne about other problems. And he also mentions that he had read the Latin treatise De Motu Cordis, mentioned to him by Mersenne previously. Descartes also added that his explanation of the movement of the heart differs slightly from his own view, although he saw it only after having finished writing on this topic. This treatise explaining the movement of the heart is also the treatise explaining the movement of the blood in living creatures. In these two brilliant demonstrations by William Harvey, a fully qualified doctor, anatomy is of paramount importance, as shown in the title, Exercitatio Anatomica de Motu Cordis et Sanguinis in Animalibus, an anatomical disputation on the movement of the heart and the blood in living creatures, published in 1628 in Frankfurt. For us, the movement of the heart and blood circulation are just obvious, but both of them are Harvey's own discovery. This letter to Mersenne reflects an important moment in Descartes' intellectual life as well as in his intellectual evolution. It is clear that Descartes had a real and deep dialogue with the science of his time, and as far as anatomy is concerned, that he worked a lot, not only dissecting hearts and brains, fetuses, eyes, etc., but also taking into account the text and the context of the anatomical images. It then becomes clear that the entanglement of anatomical questions with philosophical issues and religious concerns delayed the writing of L'Homme and forced Descartes to modify it. After the reading of the true anatomical novelties contained in Harvey's Latin anatomical disputation about the movement of the heart and the circulation of the blood, and after the reading of the chapters on the anatomy of the brain in the treatises of Vesalius and the others, Descartes faced complex issues whose stake goes beyond the medical field. He understood that he needed to modify some parts in L'Homme before giving it up, while allowing copies to be made. And he also probably realized at the same moment that he needed to correct and complete the regulae before he abandoned them. Descartes' silence in the following months is significant, as is the announcement in July 1633 that Le Monde, which includes l'homme, is, I quote Descartes, almost completed, but that he still has to correct and describe it, and that he has trouble working on it. Descartes hopes to keep his promise to send it to Mersenne at the end of the year. In November 1633, he learned of the condemnation of Galileo's Dialogo sopra I due massimi sistemi del mondo, dialogue on the two chief world systems, by Rome. And Descartes gave up publishing his treatise. Part 2. From l'homme to the discourse with la dioptrique, anatomy, dissection, anthropology, and metaphysics. Descartes took some years to publish anonymously in Leyden his first book, The Discourse on Method, with 3 essays, including La Dioptrique. In these 2 texts, The Discourse and La Dioptrique, anatomy is an important topic. In The Discourse, published in 1637, Descartes alluded to l'homme, but this is neither an abstract nor a reliable account of his work. L'homme is indeed a starting point in Descartes' medical thoughts, but the publication of the Discourse and the Dioptrique shows a rearrangement of the themes, and from it onward, a deepening of the main themes. Compared to l'homme, the Discourse on Method contains 2 novelties of paramount importance, including for the writings that will follow. The first novelty in the discourse is the approval of the circulation of the blood, with an emphasis on the anatomical proofs given by Harvey, and linked with Descartes' Latin's fragments dealing with his own dissections of hearts and animal fetuses and embryos, in which Descartes paid attention to the order of appearance of the organs. Descartes confirmed Harvey's experiment about the primacy of the heart in the embryo, the heart being the principle of life. Descartes also mentioned his disagreement with Harvey on the cause of the movement of the heart. Descartes insisted on the heat in the heart being the cause of its movement, and this heat is compared to fermentation. The second novelty is the explanation of the difference between human beings and animals. The discourse aims to resolve what Descartes qualifies as difficulties that belong to medicine. However, these difficulties and their solution by Descartes initiate a new conception of man, a new anthropology, which makes it possible to dissolve aporia existing in anatomy about the relations between the soul and the body of man, on the singularity of the rational soul, and, as Descartes indicates, on the difference between our soul and that of the beast. These themes are obviously related to the debates found in anatomical books, and I think that the anatomical problems Descartes had to face about hearts and brains give the key to the evolution of the themes, as well as to the introduction of new themes between l'homme and the discourse with la dioptrique. With respect to the medical context of the first half of the 17th century, the choice of the heart as the main subject of study is significant on interwoven major topics. The heart, principal organ since Aristotle, disputed the role of mediator between the soul and the body with the brain or part of the brain. It was indeed a theme of traditional importance. Anatomists insisted that it was very difficult to describe its admirable composition and structure, but by doing so, one gains access to marvelous secrets of nature. Trying to explain the movement of the heart, which is so difficult to observe without the help of suitable tools, which was the case in the 17th century, was a real challenge. Anatomists thought that it was known only to nature and to God alone. And Harvey quotes this both to show how complex the question is and how daring his own explanation is. The challenge of the movement of the heart shows the entanglement of metaphysical and medical themes at the time of the reception of Harvey's treatise. I have already mentioned this and explained the importance of Harvey in Descartes' thought from the publication of the Discourse on Method to Les Passions de l'âme, the passion of the soul, and La description du corps humain, the description of the human body. Descartes was on the first to approve this brilliant discovery. But his approval is also a rewriting, because Descartes didn't mention the Aristotelian reference that gave birth, according to Harvey himself, to the definition of the circular movement of the blood in animals. In an implicit but relevant manner, Descartes eradicates the soul principle of life, so fundamental in medicine, thanks to the distinction made between a soul known and recognized in a thinking activity and a body reduced to extended matter. What is clear from the discourse is that there is nothing in the medical tradition similar to the Cartesian principle of life reduced to the fire without light in the heart, to the heat in the heart reduced to fermentation. These are not the only novelties contained in the publication of 1637. Likewise, La Dioptrique innovates in medicine by its analysis of the senses, in particular sight, and by his study of the nerves, about which Descartes claimed that anatomists and doctors have not yet clearly distinguished the uses. With all these novelties, l'homme became de facto obsolete, passé. I now wish to show that anatomy, and especially the dissection of hearts and brains, are directly linked to the evolution of Descartes' thought. To understand this, we must return to the end of 1632 and to the sentence, "I am presently anatomizing the heads of various animals to explain what imagination, memory, etc. consist of." I think that this sentence has not yet received the attention it required. This is a bold statement because the anatomy of the brain, even more than the anatomy of the heart, gives rise to medical, philosophical, metaphysical, and religious consideration and controversies. Dissecting the hearts and brains of animals is not only to examine an anatomical structure, trying, for instance, to see in detail the valves in the heart and the small nerve of the heart, as well as the pineal gland and the vessels and the nerves in the brain. These dissections lead to confront the problem of the status and of the seat of the principle of life, either in the heart, according to Aristotle, or in the brain, according to Galen. Dissecting animal brains also leads to consider the specificity of the human soul and to take into account the unique mental faculties of imagination, reason, and memory studied since antiquity in the context of the question dealing with the nature of man. When opening Vesalius Fabrica, on the chapter dealing with the function of the parts of the heart, Vesalius asked, of which soul the heart is the seat. When opening Vesalius Fabrica to look at the anatomical images of the brain, which are the essential tool for carrying out the dissection undertaken by Descartes and recorded in the Excerpta Anatomica, Descartes was confronted with a question raised by Vesalius in his study on the brain. I think that this question became a true obstacle to the further writing of l'homme. These issues engage in a decisive way both a new anthropology and a new metaphysics. So let's come back to the main problems that Descartes encountered in his investigation of the brain, based on the Vesalius questions relayed by Fabricius and, moreover, by Bohin. This medical context linked with Descartes' dissections allow us to take the measure of the considerable innovation in the discourse on method and in the dioptric. Vesalius records that the irascible soul sits in the earth, but he refuses to admit that the hegemonic or sovereign principle of the soul is located there. He did not agree with either the Aristotelians or the Stoics, with the earth as the source of voluntary movement on nerves. He follows Galen and places the main soul, princeps anima, in the brain. According to Vesalius, this princeps anima is that by means of which we imagine, we reason, and we remember. These functions imagination, reasoning, memory are linked to the study of the brain. Vesalius, in agreement with theologians, distinguishes a single soul endowed with three faculties. According to Vesalius, the life force of the soul is contained in the heart, and Vesalius wrote that he can quite possibly know the function of the brain with probability. On the other hand, he can't understand in a satisfactory manner how the brain performs its function in imagination, reasoning, thought, memory. He quotes philosophers and speaks of the abyss of impiety into which fall those who undertake to examine with their own hands into human and animal bodies. In his study of the heart, Vesalius asserted that the physician must think of the faculties and the seat of the soul. In his study of the brain, Vesalius evokes the memory of the reading of Aristotle's De Anima by his professor of theology in Leuven and the thesis of the three ventricles of the brain with their position and function. Anterior ventricle in the front, second ventricle, anterior ventricle at the forehead, seat of common sense, second ventricle devoted to reason, and third ventricle devoted to memory. And Vesalius is there pursuing attacks already mentioned in the preface. And he said that if we believe in this image, these are representations from those who have never observed the talent of our Creator in the making of the human body. This is the image that has to be thrown away. Since this opinion has to be rejected, the brain has to be described completely in a new way. And Vesalius explains the dissection of the brain as an expert in skillfully conducted dissections. Doesn't he dissect with his embroidered jacket? Vesalius was the first to offer illustrations of human brains following the course of dissection, with a text linked to the images. Vesalius described with precision the craniectomy in order to release the dura mater resistant meninges which protect the brain. Several anatomical plates of human brains since Vesalius show the hair and the ears which allow the edge to hold better under the blows of the small saw which removes the skull box. Yes, we are a long way from medical scans. Vesalius knew that to describe the functions of the cerebral ventricles, calling into question the powers of the sovereign soul, involved a degree of impiety because of the very resemblance between the brains of human beings and that of quadrupeds. Although we have to deny quadrupeds all faculty of reason and above all, a rational soul in accordance with the teaching of theologians. Indeed, the conformation of the ventricles of the brain in sheep, goats, oak, cats, monkey, dogs, and even in birds that Vesalius had dissected is not different from that of the human brain, apart from the variation in volume in proportion to the degree of reason which seems to have been granted to them. As the brain convolution appear, Vesalius added, you can learn what these convolutions look like by looking at the brain of any animal at lunch or dinner. But when it comes to considering their function, not only doctors, but also philosophers take the greatest pain, arguing whether human intelligence is due to these convolutions or not. And Galen, opposing the view of Erasistratus, stated the following view. Even asses have a very complex cerebrum, whereas if we consider their ignorance, their brains should be simple in all parts and uniform. Vesalius regretted that Galen stopped his thinking at this point, but he himself quickly stops his comparison, and he thanks God for having endowed man with a rational soul. So, how to understand the function of the brain, how to see clearly when the debates are even more lively on the intracerebral structure than on the structure of the heart. It should be remembered that the anatomical observation were in those days made only with the help of the eyes and the hands. The difficulty of the dissection of the brain has to be noted because of the rapid corruption of the brain. This is what makes it impossible, for instance, to observe the pineal gland during public anatomy lessons, which Descartes laments. Indeed, the dissection, only in winter, proceeds according to a codified order, and the opening of the corpse begins, for obvious reasons of conservation, with a lower belly and continues with a median belly, the thoracic cavity, then the upper belly, the cranial cavity. Descartes evokes the dissection of a female body, which he attended in Leyden because he wished to observe the pineal gland, and though he knew very well where it must have been, because he was used to finding it in freshly killed animals without any difficulty. It was, however, impossible for him to recognize it. And Descartes added, and an old professor who made this anatomy confessed to me that he had never been able to see it in any human body. What I believe comes from what they usually need, a few days to see the intestines and other parts before opening the head. Descartes' observations are fully correct. The difficulty in observing the brain in order to deduce its functions also comes from the complexity of this anatomical structure, from the dissection cuts, from the angles at which you observe. More than any other dissection, a successful brain dissection means doing it several times. And digging into the ventricles of the brain is to access to the generation of animal spirits, a very important question in those days. The brain is the source of animal spirits, but where exactly and how? What happens between the third and fourth ventricles? Which one takes precedence over the other? What are the respective roles of the two small glands, the pituitary and the pineal, especially the pineal, since the pituitary secretes pituitis and is linked to the evacuation of the excrementa from the brain through channels, especially towards the nose and into the throat. So what about the pineal? And what about the correspondences in this complex intracerebral area with vessel and nerves? The brain is also the origin of motor and sensory nerves, but where exactly? And what is the structure of the nerves, especially of the optic nerves? What about the controversy? Although the hollow nature of the optic nerve. One thing is certain, Vesalius recommended observing the brain of an adult lamb or sheep in order to see well, because the organs are larger and better formed. Boin took up the idea, put it into practice, just like Descartes. Descartes, at the heads of recently killed animals, brought home to examine the intracerebral structure, as shown in particular by the precise dissection of a sheep's brain in the Excerpta Anatomica, an echo of which can be directly found in Ladioptric Discourses 5 and 6. In his dissections, Descartes carefully examined the intracerebral structure, especially the vessels and nerves, as well as the pituitary and pineal glands, which he did not confuse. The persistent and troublesome question of the difference between animals and humans was also alluded to by Fabricius of Aquapendente and raised by Gaspard Boin. Boin reorganized an anatomical treatise in his Theatrum Anatomicum according to the order of dissection. He reorganized the images on the earth and also on the intracerebral structure, added other. And Boin showed another way of dissecting the brain by a section at the base by Costanzo Varolio. All these anatomical questions arise within the more general framework of the fundamental question. Since the nature of human hearts is the same as in many animals, since the brains of some animals really look like human brains, what about the human specificity? Since the proximity of human brains to that of quadrupeds is so great, is there anything more that can be learned from anatomy? given that theologians deny all power of reason to brute animals, as Vesalius wrote. With the heart and the brain, and with the question of generation, he had to take up again to see the primacy of the heart in embryos. Descartes faced the most difficult anatomical question, and it took him a long time to analyze all these problems. This is all the more true since Descartes also proposed an explanation of the senses, of pain, and even of complex medical phenomena linked with the obscure question of the union of the soul to the body, according famous physicians and surgeons. Part 3, the influence of the discourse and la dioptrique, the posthumous publication of Lom. The innovative medical, anthropological, and medical issues of the discourse and the dioptrique were perceived by the first readers of these texts, the physician Plempius and the theologian Fromondus, who were also the first objectors to Descartes' new philosophy. Among these important objections, one of them was raised about the analysis of sensations in the dioptrique, and especially the explanation of pain. Fromondus expressed surprise with a Cartesian explanation of pain taking place in the brain, and he put forward the traditional qualitatem dolorificam, the so-called quality of pain. In his answer, Descartes referred to doctors and surgeons to support his conceptions, and he quotes for the first time the example of the young girl. The example is so of the young girl who had a serious wound in her hands and had been amputated because of creeping gangrene. But for some weeks, she didn't know about the amputation of her arm, thanks to the bandages placed on the arm and the fact that her eyes were blindfolded when the surgeon approached. Meanwhile, this girl was complaining of various pains in her fingers, wrist, and forearm. According to Descartes, this was obviously due to the condition of the nerves in her arm, which formerly led from her brain to those parts of her body. This analysis of what will become the phantom limb syndrome is then detailed in the sixth meditation, where Descartes asserts that in no way affects the unity of the soul. Descartes quotes the example of that young girl with her amputated hand in his Principles. And it proves that the pain in the hand is felt by the soul, not because it is present in the hand, but because it is present in the brain. Extending the analysis of sensation given in the dioptrique, this example is important in the history of anatomy. We have to remember Rembrandt's Anatomy of Dr. Tulp and the emphasis given on the arm and the hand. Why such an emphasis on the arm in an anatomy lesson? We need to remember that the first book of Galen's De Usu Partium, containing 25 chapters, is devoted to the hand, as well as the beginning of the second book. Why? Of course, because the hand is a specific advantage of human beings, thanks to its versatility. And we have to remember that Aristotle claimed that the hand is organum organorum, the organ or tool produced by nature to use tools. Aristotle also claimed against Anaxagoras that it is because man is the most intelligent animal that he has got hands. Hence the praises to the admirable human hand in anatomical treatises and the link between the hand and the perfection of the human body. By contrast, there is no praise to the hand in Descartes' works. And Descartes, in a letter to Melon, where he recalls that he had examined the circulation of the blood, wrote, "We do not think that a man who has a lost arm or a leg is less a man than any other." No doubt that Descartes was thinking of his friend Polo, who lost one of his arms, But this statement is also against the Galenist tradition in medical and surgical books, emphasizing the importance of the end in the human body. Descartes rejected this tradition and insisted on the union of a soul to a body to define a real man as stated in the discourse after the supposition in l'homme and before the precisions given in the sixth meditation and in the passions. The influence of the new medical ideas contained in the discourse and in the dioptrique was important on the physician Henricus Regius, who became professor in medicine in the recent University of Utrecht. Regius asked his students to defend the thesis he wrote with Descartes, who wanted to remain a hidden co-author, and that contained some of these considerable innovations from the physiologia. We have to remember that the novelty of the circulation of the blood, explained in the Cartesian manner by Regius, was at the origin of the famous Utrecht quarrel. Descartes' laudatory attitude towards Harvey and his discovery of the circulation of the blood remains the same from the publication of the Discourse on Method to the publication of Les Passions de l'âme, the Passions of the Soul, in 1549 in Amsterdam and in Paris, just before Descartes left Holland for Sweden, where he died on the 11th of February 1650, 4 months after his arrival. It must be noted that there was no trace of l'homme in the inventories made in Leyden and in the so-called Stockholm one after Descartes' death. It was not only because of the controversy with Regius, but also because the text of l'homme had become obsolete, passé compared to Descartes' published books, the Discourse and the Dioptrique, and also the Passions of the Soul. The first part of the Passion deals with the nature of man, as it was the case at the beginning of Descartes' research in medicine. But the Passions are linked with an updated text called La description du corps humain, the description of the human body, quoted in the Stockholm inventory. And we know that Descartes brought with him to Stockholm his most important papers. 12 years after Descartes' death, and thanks to one of the copies of Descartes' manuscript of l'homme that had been circulating, a Latin translation was published in Leyden in 1662 under the faithful title De Homine. This Latin edition has a foreword ad lectorem, quoting many authors from Aristotle to Regius, some books including the Bible and Augustine, and taking into account the first volume of Descartes' letter, published by Clercellier in 1657. Jules is also clear about his reluctance to admit that the principle of life can be reduced to the heat in the earth. This kind of catch-all foreword has been translated into French and placed at the end of the French edition of l'homme, published in Paris by Clercellier 2 years after the Latin translation. Clercellier used another manuscript of l'homme, claiming at the beginning of his own preface that it was the original one, which is not true. He also published l'homme together with another text, a treatise on the formation of the fetus. This title, not recorded in the inventories, matches with the description of the human body. Clercellier changed the title, emphasizing on the new topic, the study of the formation of the fetus contained in this treatise compared to l'homme. In the description of the human body, Descartes was obviously trying to avoid the perceived attitude of wonder of many physicians, the obscure controversies on all the prolix discussions in medical treatises about the male semen, the female, the existence or not of a female semen, etc. The Cartesian method is represented by the following principle: the existence of the two semen, male and female, and also the idea that heat and fermentation are the driving force that explains generation. What is also clearly expressed in the description of the human body is a question of the order of the formation of the parts during the development in the womb of the mother. In the discourse and method, the earth was to become the first organ to appear, and the movement of the earth was to become the first and most widespread movement that we observe in living creature. This thesis was formulated under the influence of Harvey's treatise. Once the priority of the earth has been admitted and checked with dissections of calves at different stages of their development and observations on incubated eggs, Descartes promoted his conception of the heat in the earth, which is a kind of fire without light. This principle of movement and life, as mentioned at the end of L'Homme, is a corporeal principle, as stated in the Passions and as quoted in some letters. This principle of life is fully detailed in the last text dealing with medicine written by Descartes, La Description du corps humain. Indeed, the earth, its detailed structure, its movement, its cause, and its formation, and also the circulation of the blood, hence the formation of the veins and arteries, are the most important topics in La Description. They are more crucial than the question of generation, although the latter was emphasized by Claire Solier when publishing La Description. This text details the state principles in Les Passions, the earth and blood, on which depend all the good of the body. Indeed, anatomy and mechanics are of paramount importance in Descartes' works, and this connection between anatomy and mechanics is of the highest significance, since it rules out the alternative connection between anatomy and finalism and between anatomy and vitalism. At the beginning of La Description, Descartes thus explicitly condemns our ignorance of anatomy and mechanics. Descartes invoked the rules or laws of mechanics in order to explain the formation of the valves in the heart that were a traditional subject of wonder. For Descartes, the body is no longer an object of admiration, provoking teleological or theological considerations, as in the medical tradition. It is an object of investigation of the movements which govern it, and in the first place, those of the heart and the blood. What is implicit with this change in the title is that Claire Solier avoided the medical subject of the circulation of the blood, which was still controversial in France. The medicine faculty in Paris was still rejecting the circulation of the blood in 1664, when Claire Solier published L'Homme, together with La Description. La Description is therefore closely linked with Harvey's two brilliant demonstrations on the movement of the heart and on the movement of the blood. This is the major interest of the description, which is also a more accurate text related with the two published books where Descartes had claimed his approval of the circulation of the blood, the Discourse and Method and the Passions, in particular, the brief account of the parts of the body and of some of their functions, article number 7. As in the Discourse and in the Passions, in La Description, Descartes quotes Harvey's name in Latin. As in the Passion, Descartes condemns those who still have a very prejudiced view and are unable to accept the circular movement of the blood and to distinguish the true and certain reasons from the false and probable ones. The description is also linked with the fifth part of the Discourse and the Passions of the Soul, articles 8 and 9, concerning the explanation about the movement of the heart and of its cause different from Harvey's explanation. If, as Harvey asserts, the expulsion of blood occurs during systole, which is a phase of contraction of the heart and thereby the phase of its diminution in volume, there must be something in the heart that is the cause of its contraction. In La Description, Descartes explained clearly. No, if we suppose that the earth moves in the way Harvey describes, we must imagine some faculty which causes this movement. Yet the nature of this faculty is much harder to conceive of than whatever Harvey purports to explain by invoking it. Among some other complex questions raised in the posthumous edition of L'Homme, Laforge asks the one of the movement of the muscles, the most difficult to understand, an echo of Claircelier's preface, where the movement is qualified, of the most important action for the author to describe and explain. But the fundamental question of the principle of all the functions performed by a living body, explained by Descartes in a new way, as confirmed in the Passions, article number 8, and in La Description, is avoided and nearly ignored by Schul, Claircelier, and Laforge in the Passions of the Soul, as well as in La Description. Descartes clearly denounced the error of believing that the soul is the principle responsible for all bodily movements. The fundamental methodological challenge of dualism and the clear-cut distinction between the principle of life and the soul, which breaks with the medical tradition, legitimates the comparison of the body with a machine and changes the definition of death. Death never occurs through the fault of the soul, but only because of the principal organs of the body disintegrates. Thank you very much.